Mhm.
Okay. Well, I want to welcome everyone to our third annual PRISM. My name is Justin Hannenberg, and I am the past chair of the ASCLS Diversity Advocacy Council, or DAC. I will be moderating this session. My guest this evening is Thomas Burke, a scientist specializing in food safety and traceability, to talk about experiences with the hiring process for scientific positions living with disability. Before we begin, a quick update on our PRISM program for the week. PRISM, as you may know, stands for Pride, Respect, Inclusion, Support, and Momentum. And it is designed to increase awareness and create more conversations around topics in diversity, equity, and inclusion within our organization. Our DAC programming will continue to host events through 7 p.m. today and also in tomorrow, January 18th. It'll be our final day of PRISM, and we will have the DAC Book Club recap with our discussing Sitting Pretty, The View from My Ordinary Resilient Disabled Body by Rebecca Taussig. Thank you to Kathy Owig for hosting that event. And also please remember that the Glenda Price Diversity in Leadership Award online fundraiser is underway until January 18th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. To participate in the online auction, visit the website available to you, and I'll drop this link in the chat, egivesmart.com/events/VSVQ. Put that in just shortly. You can donate directly by texting PRISM23 to 76878. I will also include that in the chat. We really appreciate your contributions, whether you decide to donate, to bid for an item. We have some special items there also for Letty to possibly dye her hair a variety of colors. And this year you may also, and so then I'm going to take it now to our dynamic discussion. Each year we bring the dynamic discussion to PRISM and get someone to invite from an outside perspective from our organization to help motivate us with a more inclusive mindset and expand our perspective. This session has the purpose of incorporating the presenter that's made strides in DE&I into their own professional space. And the goal of this session for our audience is to feel inspired, engaged, and committed to implementing new ideas and have a positive impact in day-to-day discussions. We'd like to remind the audience that this is a brave space. And as such, the space invites varying opinions through respectful and civil dialogue. It emphasizes the intention of the speaker may differ from the impact of their speech on listeners, but that speaker must also take care to not inflict intentional harm on others. It recognizes that people are free to engage or not in challenging conversations. I will be their session moderator, helping to navigate questions on the chat or verbally as time allows. And please make sure to have your microphone muted until you're directed to engage with the discussion. And I will call your name if you have something in the chat or with a question. So I want to again thank Thomas Burke for joining us, subject matter expert in food traceability with an emphasis in food safety, sustainability, IT architecture that includes blockchain implementation, supply chain visibility standards, and interoperability. His research and professional interests have particular emphasis on using transdisciplinary approaches to resolving challenges in food system technology and policy. Professionals with disabilities must make choices based on their realities of their own constraints, as well as the societal restrictions and even discrimination. Thomas will discuss his personal experiences of disability and how that shaped his career arc from a microbiologist to a specialized food safety specialist. He will focus on how he used models of disability to form his identity as a person with a disability and also to take decisive action that maximize his career goals in the life sciences. Themes will include disability theory, disability within DE&I initiatives, and also talking about reasonable accommodations. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Burke.
Thanks so much, Justin, and thanks so much, ASCLS, for hosting me. I'm really looking forward to discussing these topics today, and being able to bring my experience to life here. So I am going to share my screen, and I'm going to share some slides while I work through this. Are you able to see the screen appropriately? I'd practiced this once, but I want to make sure.
Yeah, we sure can.
Okay, thank you so much. Again, thank you so much for having me. And today I'm going to be talking about navigating disability in the life sciences. I know that my professional experience is somewhat outside of ASCLS and what maybe your membership works with on a day-to-day basis, but I think it will be really applicable. And given Justin's introduction, I seem to be right in line with what the theme of this series is supposed to be. And what I want to really have you take home from this presentation are a variety of tools to think about disability and to actually think about its progression through our society and how that interacts with individuals when they're actually working through these issues on their own, and how they develop as people and as professionals. So, I started with this artwork that depicts a gentleman named Ed Roberts, born in 1939. And he was a disability activist and is often credited as the father of independent living. And he is somebody that actually throughout my life, I've found inspiration from, just because of his audacity and his sheer influence on the human rights campaign that was disability rights. He faced difficulties at every iteration of his education, of his professional development, and as his humanity as a United States citizen. And one of the things that really he is known for, but is not necessarily the only thing that he did, not by any means, was that his advocacy as a UC Berkeley student started with really ensuring that the implementation of curb cuts, right? Which is something that you think is ubiquitous or commonplace, but wasn't actually necessarily something that was incorporated into day-to-day urban planning. And it was this highlighting of a particular solution that was really universal, that was able to bridge gaps and bring a modicum of ability to individuals in an everyday way, and something that is not necessarily intrusive, but something that is inclusive. It really epitomizes to me this same right to participate in society that everyone, regardless of disability status, has. And so I kind of wanted to start that as, a person of inspiration, a person to research maybe after my talk, to look at the progression of disability rights as a movement. And it's, considering that this talk is the day after MLK Day, is to really look at, where we have gone as a country in terms of the right to participation, regardless of who we are and what background that we have. So I'm going to first start with, just the overall outline of what I'd like to go over today. I will first introduce myself, because in all of the concepts that I'm talking about, I'm using myself as an example. And I'm really contextualizing the concepts through my life experience. So it's pretty relevant to talk about myself and really where I am and where I progressed from. And then I'm going to go through the 4 models of disability that I found really compelling and useful for my, determining what were the decisions that were right for me, and, figuring out where I exist, where I needed to be in society as a whole. And then through that, we're going to kind of talk through, disability in life sciences, identity within society, employment, and DEI initiatives. And then I'll talk a little bit about what does the future of disability hold in the workforce. So to start, I wanted to kind of just go over who I am and, where I, to kind of contextualize what my experience has been and where I really, where some of my professional experiences may resonate with your membership. And, I started as wanting to become a research microbiologist in my undergraduate, aspirations, right? I found the, idea of researching biological systems and their interplay with our understanding of the universe to be very, very interesting and very applicable to the way that I really saw the world. And as I was getting into my research studies and my work towards those goals, the medical conditions that I had growing up continued to worsen. So I grew up with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis and ankylosing spondylitis, autoimmune disorders that gave me chronic pain and fatigue, which are really going to be the hallmarks of the disability that I experience, and that I'll talk about throughout this this presentation. But when those issues were occurring, I was also simultaneously trying to form my identity as a professional and where I needed to be, or where I needed to orient my skills to be successful as a young person. I grew up, I finished high school right around the time of the, Great Recession. And really employability was at the top of everybody's minds, regardless of their ability. And I really needed to figure out, how could I work on these types of, research questions, these types of, pursuits to, contribute to the greater good, while also being realistic to what my disabilities really limited me to, and what the realities that I would be facing as an individual with disability when it came to employment, when it came to educational hurdles, when it came to, really overall achievement. So I decided to work to get my master's in epidemiology, and then I progressed to, at each step, towards something that I could apply those biological principles to, that laboratory expertise that I learned in my undergraduate and graduate studies, but being able to do it with technology and tools that empowered me and allowed me to continue to work despite the challenges that I faced, but also allowed me to be successful. And really, in some ways, the balancing act that I continue to have throughout my career and throughout my life contributes to the thinking style and design patterns that I incorporate into my work, and really can kind of harkens to that transdisciplinary approach that I am so excited about when I'm working in my field. So it really progressed to being a digital technologist, looking at how I can use technology to, automate, to take in data and to process and analyze that data for, spearheading or contributing to physical processes. And this has really culminated into me being a food traceability expert. This is somewhat of a summary of what I've been of my life here, and I'm a little bit deliberate in that case because I'm actually going to go through these steps of my development as a professional in depth as I progress through the models of disability. A lot of the, as I will go to this next slide here, a lot of where I found confidence and success in figuring out my identity came through my some of these questions, that soul searching questions that I had in my graduate school courses, in my graduate school life, when I was struggling to figure out what I was going to be able to do for 40 hours a week, that I had the ability to do sustainably, that I had the ability to do in a way that empowered me and allowed me to flourish, rather than it just being merely a way for me to, generate an income. And what at my master's institution at Emory University, they had a huge section on disability theory, and this is where I really delved into the models of disability further than what I had even experienced in the past and some of the disability support services that I was afforded when I was a high school student. And through some of these models of disability, in explaining them, it was, a lot of the theory was framing up what disability really is as a concept, right? That is the entire, that's the entire paradigm to using models, is the realization that disability is something that is very contextual, it's something that's very individualized, it's something that is hard to generalize. And it does have a root of being indifference, right? And there was a very compelling disability theory text that I was reading where it was actually trying to analyze what is the root emotion of ableism that occurs. And what this particular theorist had posited was that ableism has its root in disgust, which is really something that sounds incredibly harsh, but it really is trying to figure out a concept of, discrimination, of prejudice. And in that, it was trying to figure out, where are those negative feelings coming from? And the idea of disgust is actually not necessarily at the person that is in front of you or the person that's in front of the person that is being ableist. It is this idea that the disability is a reminder of the imperfection of everybody's body, and that we are always in a continuous state of decline because of our inherent mortality. And this is, I found it to be a very powerful concept because it made the concept more universal in nature. It made it a component of the human condition. And when you do that, then it allows you to frame disability in terms of common life experiences, and actually allows you to think about it in terms of just framing human conditions and the way that you accomplish or get through or adapt to those conditions. And I found this really lovely diagram on the right from the National Academy of Sciences that really was going through some of these factors that go into the models of disability. But what I want to really take home with this slide is really that they are ways to frame disability. They can be used in this kind of theoretical contexts and even in policy contexts, but actually in practice, I found them very beneficial. They were ways for me to think about where my body was at and where the challenges that I was facing, and looking at solutions in which I could help ameliorate them. So the models that I'm going to go through are the medical model, the social model, the functional model, and a human rights model of disability. There are a litany of models that you could possibly examine. And if you actually needed to create one for a particular, thesis or, examination of disability, you probably could. And I will note here that medical and social are generally the most common, and, it's really actually often presented as a dichotomy, but you really can frame the concept of disability through a variety of means, and they can have successes depending on what you're looking to accomplish. So I want to have this slide here to really epitomize the experience that I had growing up as a person with medical conditions that presented, functional limitations in my life, and really what you end up thinking about in this medical model of disability. When for many folks that have disabilities, they will initially start experiencing this in the context of, a clinic, of medical doctor, of a diagnosis, and they will let both your medical practitioner and yourself are going to consider it around those circumstances. And I'm not saying necessarily that is a inherently flawed way of thinking about disability, but it is limited. It's going to make you think of yourself as a patient first. You're going to think about yourself in terms of having the defect first. And it also makes you think in a medical coding context, which we all know is not necessarily the most perfect way of even modeling medical conditions, right? Which can be multifactorial, which may have some diagnostic criteria or may not have others, and you end up forming an identity around a medical diagnosis, which is not necessarily the most helpful way of being able to navigate, a complex world. If there isn't necessarily an intervention to, aid you in the medical condition that you are having, then there are limited ways of being able to work through that. And as I was growing up, I had this challenge. Of, do I have, is my arthritis actually justifying me being disabled well enough? And it was a crisis of identity at times, because as you probably know, rheumatic conditions, particularly with how well you respond to medical treatment, may ebb and flow. So you may feel fine sometimes, and then you may not feel fine at other times. And sometimes when you're not feeling fine, you may visibly look okay, but you might not actually feel okay. And so if you're not looking disabled, then are you really disabled? And you want to know, like, is this actually a rightful identity or not? And and that's really what I was really struggling with for a large part of my life, was this, viewing my disability only through interactions with medical personnel, or thinking about it in terms of a 504 plan or an IEP, or, school accommodations. And it's really epitomized by this idea, are you disabled enough? Is this the criteria that fits you, another person's idea of what, your condition is? But again, as I was saying, it's not useful. It's the benefits are that if there are aspects of your disability that require medical intervention, there is a means to be able to help that. And it definitely helped me. As I was treated by my pediatrician and pediatric rheumatologist, I went into successful remission. But that crisis of identity really presented itself to me when I was still feeling pain, and I was still feeling a great deal of fatigue. But, from the medical laboratory results, I seemed fine. I had no inflammation. I didn't have, the diagnostic criteria. So what did that mean? And then when I finally got a diagnosis as an adult as having fibromyalgia, it did make me feel better, because I was still in this mindset of thinking of myself as a disabled person through a medical model. And I realized later how flawed that was, because, in that am I, aren't I wasn't actually really resolving my challenges, nor was I actually seeking all the resources that were available to me. And when I started exploring disability theory and looking more at how we can conceptualize ourselves as disabled folks, the most immediate resources that you'll find will contrast the medical model with the social model. And as you notice, these are actually two parts of the same comic. I just have split them out here to not spoil it in the initial slide. But in this former slide, it's it's identifying the problem as that the person has an inability to walk, or has an impaired mobile ability, and that it needs to be cured through prosthetics or through medical intervention. And then the social model is really looking at understanding that actually the way that they navigate and ambulate is fine, and it works in context without stairs. We just have to figure out a way for this situation with stairs to work for this person's way of being. And that's really what started down this path for me of looking at disability, is really more of a gap between what is socially expected of a mind and body, and what is one's reality of the body that you do have. Focusing on these gaps can help bring about solutions in unique ways that you wouldn't necessarily have found in a medical context. Again, really epitomized by this, but for me, a lot of this was thinking about how can I balance my level of fatigue with the type of coursework that I was going to undergo. So one of my big decisions in going from being a laboratory professional to being an epidemiologist was this ability to pivot based on what my physical limitations and what my physical needs dictated, right? Then I would be able to have a little bit more control over what my built environment is. I think what is the most powerful about the social model is it really examines what this built environment is, and how it is built for what the idealized body should look like. It's not necessarily to critique what that is. It's just to realize that there is this base expectation of performance on certain bodily functions that brings about this gap and has disability arise from that. And this model is especially powerful because there can be circumstances where disability doesn't necessarily exist as in a social manner, when these types of accommodations or universal design are implemented, because the gap between individuals can be ameliorated or eliminated through this type of lens. So as I kind of progressed from this epidemiologic mindset to my future my future career goals, I really still was presented with issues regarding my overall functioning, issues regarding my most immediate needs. And this is where I pivoted even further to a functional mindset, working with a way to problem solve around the particular circumstances of my disability and where they existed in my career choices. So at every step of the way, I realized that, even when I was having, success in starting my public health career, I wanted to be able to elevate the circumstances of the challenges that I was seeing in my field, while also working with my style of work, my needs for being able to work from a computer, to work flexibly, to be able to work, in a hybrid environment. And this is before I think hybrid environments was even really a common thing with the proliferation of COVID. And what I knew was at that time, those that were able to dictate the terms of their employment the best, while also being formidable and influential, policymakers and researchers, were those that worked on the computer science of the biological sciences. Bioinformaticists was a really hot field at this time, but also there was this movement towards the digitalization of supply chain systems. And that's where I saw a confluence between the challenges that I saw in foodborne illness investigations and the, implementation of, new technology to expedite the information and fact finding of problematic products and supply chains. And then I saw this as a way for me to, grow as a professional in this burgeoning field, while also being able to make adaptations and, be able to have control over my life and my work environment to an even further degree than what would be afforded to me in maybe working in a federal agency under Schedule A, for instance, which is a federal program for disability hiring. I found I found it very challenging very early in my career to take advantage of disability-related employment programs, because they aren't necessarily optimized for the type of work that I wanted to do. And that's why I really kind of took this independent pathway towards finding ways to still have achievement while working with my disabilities. And I have this picture here of this. This is actually from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. They have this employment guide to help students try to figure out what majors they want to be. And this is what the picture of an epidemiologist was, right? And I don't know what epidemiologist actually works with this big, I think this big microscope right beside them. And actually, I swear this is actually like a radiologist or something. But anyway, but what I was struck by when I was thinking about what my future employment would be was that he is not, standing on his feet for, 8, 10, 12 hours, in a laboratory, but is able to work in, with a mouse and keyboard, which is what I really needed to face the reality of when I was working as a professional and having difficulty even sitting up for 8 hours a day. But this functional model is really concentrating on really what are the physical needs that you have and what are the tools that can help facilitate those functional limitations. It has a somewhat of a rehabilitative context to it, and it actually is kind of limited in a similar way that the medical model is. But I would argue that this is a very helpful and complementary model when you're thinking about the social model to accomplishing the goals that you're looking to accomplish. So when, and it's probably a very deeply personal model to examine yourself through. You wouldn't necessarily use this to examine others unless you were working with them on, specific solutions. But it is a way to work through these inherent challenges of frankly, these abilities that you do not necessarily possess as a disabled person are real, and it makes your life harder and makes daily tasks more difficult. It can make independent living a challenge, and to confront those face on in the context of your entire life is a really bountiful way of being able to move forward. And finally, I want to really touch on this human rights model, which is one that I find especially powerful because it kind of brings home that basis of ableism that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, where it's working with this human condition, right? The human condition that we have imperfect bodies and that they don't necessarily always perform or always have the attributes that we wish they to have. And you can really think about this as a political stance, as a means to looking at disability as a means to guarantee participation in our society. And it really goes beyond like non-discrimination laws, but really goes into, rights of dignity, rights of self-determination, the rights to have assistance, the rights to, to resources to enable independence, the right to be able to have advocacy for your needs, and the right for you as a person with disability to be able to make the best decisions for your disability. And I really love this graphic that I found from, I don't know what share.america.gov is, but it was talking about the right to participate in voting. And it really kind of epitomized the concept in one way, but it can be actually very universal to our political participation, to think about all of ourselves as on the spectrum of self-determination and of dignity, and how our bodily autonomy influences that. And I want to kind of take those models and work through the what it can mean for a person's identity. For me, as I kind of progressed through these models over my life, and it influences the way that I consider myself as a person with disability, and how, but it also, I want to illustrate that just because my experience is this way doesn't mean that it's going to be a universal experience and a universal way of thinking about disability. How your disability comes about really impacts the way that you would think about it. If you have, a developmental disability, it's something that you have experienced throughout your life, that you had at every stage of development, potentially, that maybe there was identity that was exerted on you. Maybe you were, received special education services. Maybe it was something that, your parents had a complex relationship with you regarding it. If you have a disability that resulted from a traumatic event, such as becoming, paralyzed from a car accident, or having a loss of a sense from an illness or from another traumatic event, that would also really impact the way that you think about your disability. You may be, the trauma that may be associated with your disability may really, influence like your gravitation towards whether you even accept the label at all. So as with other identities, disability isn't going to be a monolith because of these influences, because of the ways that it can come about, because of that it also is going to be it's going to be inherently intersectional, because disability can happen to any individual, regardless of race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, national origin. Disability happens in every context of the world. And because of that, the naming conventions aren't going to be uniform. So I use people first language, or I tend to use people first language, meaning that I say people with disabilities or person with disabilities, but others may find that to be, not the best way to convey it. Maybe they want to say disabled persons because they want to emphasize that difference, because life isn't always the easiest for them, or they want to, have that at the forefront of folks' mind when they're conveying their identity status. There are also identities within disability that may be, more homogeneous or more based around, a community identity, such as, and there are some that are some disabilities that may be hereditary in nature, and there actually may be some level of culture surrounding them. One famous example being the deaf community. So the way that they may think about their disability may be markedly different than someone that had it occur or had that happen to them in the middle of their life, or of having a different impairment. There is an importance, though, here that the way that disability identity was previously explored and previously thought about had a level of paternalism and infantilization of the individuals. It was they were identities that were exerted onto them. And that is something that you should keep in the back of your mind when you are considering this overall concept of identity in disability. And what is incredibly important is that to remind you that the ideas on the identity of people with disabilities really evolve over time, probably even more so than other identities that might be in DEI initiatives, because there's that that notion or that historical aspect of that exertion of labels coming from medical professionals onto people with disabilities, and their general equivalency to being slurs at times, and those terms continuously evolving or rotating due to that kind of diagnosis and slur pair relationship, but also the concepts and the tools available to us impact the way that disability may be considered. So it is important to think, as this evolves over time, to revisit and to reacquaint ourselves with the way that the disability community and communities really consider themselves. And I'll talk a little bit about my personal identity in disability and how that role really identified or evolved over time there. And for me, I actually went from this oscillation of disabled versus not disabled versus disabled versus not disabled. Not necessarily that I was never not with impairment, but it's really this, attachment to not only a identity, but to a overall being a representative of a community, and whether that entailed me having special rights, but not necessarily special rights, but special responsibilities and special values and virtues that I would need to embody and to bring into activism or community support. And as I have worked through my community, or worked through my my overall career, it has really changed with that. And now I find it to be somewhat compartmentalized. There's contexts where I will talk very freely and openly about my disability, but at other times I will not, because, to be frank, it may not be necessary to the scenario or to what the goals that I wish to accomplish. And I do have a lot of privilege in that way, that I can selectively work with that identity. But I think others that are intersectional themselves may find themselves doing code switching as a regular component of their lives. So I'm also part of the LGBT community, and so sometimes that part of that identity comes out, and sometimes it isn't there. And you have that same level of contemplation as you go through your career, or as you're going through your life. So I just want to really summarize that, disability and DEI initiatives, really thinking about these models of disability and how they are components of the identities that your coworkers form as they are going through their lives, will impact the way that you would approach their inclusion in a DEI initiative. Of course, it is a huge component of what we should be thinking about in workplaces, but there are specific needs that people with disabilities have that are looked at differently when you're thinking about organizational structures and human resources. Just to be a matter of frankness, there are needs for reasonable accommodation and for other Americans with Disability Act considerations, and there are fairness of employment, and the regulations regarding labor standards for people with disabilities can be contextual in nature. But and as I kind of epitomized in my in all of my previous slides, is that people with disabilities are going to face different challenges in the workplace depending on what their functional limitations are, the gaps between what the operations of the organization are and what their abilities are, and even medical contexts, and like whether they are able to what their treatment plan may intersect with their career needs and career trajectory. And there is this overall concept of visibility and invisibility that I kind of briefly touched on in my identity, where you are going to have folks that are in this DEI initiative that are not going to be visible, and you want to include them without making them feel compelled to disclose, because that is actually a really interesting and strange component of disability rights and disability in the workplace, is that you have the right to not disclose, and you have the right to be to give only as much documentation as is necessary for your reasonable accommodation requests. So the way that identity and the way that you would have visibility in the workforce may be approached in a different way than in other identities that might be included in a DEI initiative. And the last thing that I wanted to really go over is talking about the future of disability in the workforce. I want you to take away that the employment statistics for people with disabilities are pretty bad. There is still not full participation in the workforce that folks with disabilities would like to have. Even though we're at historically low employment, there is still an underemployment with people with disabilities. And I think that will really illustrate the systemic bias and discrimination that is faced in hiring practices and in the overall societal pressures. And there are intrinsic challenges in conventional business wisdom that are presented when working through accommodations. And expectations on what people with disabilities should be. But there are bright points as well. And people with disabilities are greatly poised to do well in the workforce. They are used to rapid adaptation, to problem-solving design, problem-solving challenges that gravitate towards using design thinking holistically about how to arrive at the best practices going forward, and being able to use new tools to bridge gaps in ability. I think some of what is generally feared with Chat GPT and all these newfangled artificial intelligence tools may actually be really natural to many people with disabilities, because we are used to being able to shape tools to our needs and being able to implement them quickly into our day-to-day lives and into our employment. So with that, I really want you to take away, review, thinking about models of disability, think about how these can be used in like a laboratory setting, and think about how they can be used in the DEI initiatives, and as well think about, what identity means to people with disabilities, how that can be nuanced depending on what their life experience was, and how it can actually influence their overall career trajectory, and realize that individuals are generally making the best decisions for them, and that they know their disability best and know the solutions in order to arrive at their own success. So thank you so much for letting me discuss my life experience with you and my thoughts on disability, and ready for some questions if we want to discuss.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I have a whole bunch of notes here from your various models and ways to think about it, and just coming up with the next time that I'm faced with questions around accessibility and disability or accommodations, different ways of framing it. I'd like to see if there's any questions in the chat. I know I have a couple for you if you're open to answering them, but I want to give a moment then to see if there's anyone in the anyone who'd like to raise their hand, if you'd like to come on and speak, or dropping them in the Q&A for us.
Justin, there is a person with their hand raised. I'm going to unmute them, okay?
Great, thank you.
Go ahead, Cynthia. You should be able to ask your question now, Cynthia.
Yeah.
I'm going to, Cynthia, if you can try to, oh, okay, it was a mistaken, no problem. Well, if anyone else has a question, feel free to raise your hand. Again, you can drop it in the Q&A. One of the questions that I have, though, for you, Thomas, thinking about our candid conversation that we had with one of our well-known ASCLS members, was talking about accommodations, and you kind of touched a bit on this before. What reminded me was like getting the right accommodations for the right person, and wanting to ask the question just in the right way, or the most approachable way, that two things. One, says it in a way that's going to be empowering to the individual, and then also, even if there maybe, but also like let them know that it's an open channel of dialogue, that some of our needs may change on a day-to-day basis, week to week, or just in different conditions. So is there a way, when, say, looking at the workplace scenario, that we prefer to be asked what kind of accommodations are needed, that makes it feel like less that it's a you problem and more of something of a realm of creativity for us to come up with the right accommodations to the individual?
Yeah, that's a great question, Justin. I think it's something that's really difficult for folks to really think about, because they don't want to like single people out or feel like they're assuming, and I can say from my personal experience what I would prefer, and what I have found the most welcoming in employment circumstances. What I really love is when there is a broad issuement of like the disability policies and like the ways to approach reasonable accommodation. So like really, when I'm looking at like a potential employment opportunity, if they have like an accessibility page, if they talk about, accessibility in the employment ad, if they talk about, their overall, resources that they have available to fulfill ADA, that brings me a lot of comfort, because I know that when I go to my supervisor or when I go to the human resources, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about when I'm asking for a reasonable accommodation. So it empowers me to be able to ask for it, because I know it exists and I know that there's education there, and I'm not going to have to make the argument or make the, or educate the, the point of contact in order to do so. And I feel like that is always the best way, is to let everybody know, because you don't know who may or may not need a reasonable accommodation. and then they feel comfortable with being able to bring it up when they need it. Because an individual may not need a reasonable accommodation, even if they're visibly disabled. So maybe a wheelchair user is doing perfectly fine. Like your building has elevators, you know, the ADA has been, you know, accommodated for in the design of hallways and indoor designs, and maybe they have no reasonable accommodation needs. So that's why, you know, leaving those resources available in just having that knowledge out there and have it commonplace and not a big deal makes it I think is the best solution, at least from my circumstance.
That makes sense. What I'm picking up from it in a way is the more proactive we can be about saying, hey, we've been thinking about this and accessibility and job description. You know, that's one way of kind of signaling to someone that, hey, we're at least thinking about it or open to the conversation. Please don't be afraid to bring it up. You know, one of the other things that you kind of brought up in talking about identity, and I think we've seen this like in the LGBTQ community, that is like not enough, not blank enough. And we've certainly talked about that here in the DAC as well. That sort of imposter syndrome that it can come of saying, you know, well, I don't need as much as the other person, are my needs as necessary. Or the ability to downplay ourselves, or the fear of judgment from others that, you know, either you're, again, not blank enough in some aspects. But one of the things that I'm also thinking of is like by making these accommodations, the more I started to think about it, I'm thinking the social model where like the stairs and the ramp, right? We start to learn more about ourselves as individuals when we start thinking about these kinds of accommodations for people who don't necessarily have, you know, the same abilities or disabilities. But one of the things that I was starting to think of is when we can make those accommodations, we start to see people's hidden potentials. And these other hidden abilities start to show up once when we don't have to worry about so much about how am I going to be able to do this job for 8 hours a day, right? When we have those sort of engineering controls or certain things that allow us to then flourish in the things that we do really well. And so I think it's, for me, just thinking about the next time that I have to go in, well, how are we going to make this accommodation? Not seeing it as a burden, but as an opportunity to really help the individual, not just the individual, but my team overall.
Yeah, no, and one of the things that's kind of interesting about the LGBTQ community and identities and people with disabilities, they are two identities that are generally non-generational in nature. So they're not something that, I mean, with some exceptions, like I talked about with some hereditary conditions, they're going to be identities that you kind of form somewhat in isolation. Like you grow up and it's not like you had gay parents or you had disabled parents and, you know, they taught you how to be disabled or gay, right? Like it's something that, you know, you are having that level of identity crisis as you mature as an adult, and it can actually impact that development as a person. So but in, you know, but yeah, I'm sorry, Justin, I'm not sure if you had a specific question there, but
no, thanks. No, thanks for your input, though. I think maybe a bit of it was just a reflection, something that I had picked up from your talk, because my brain is just spinning right now on a lot of what you've shared. And it's even what you just mentioned there about coming up in isolation. I think that's a really good tag into some of the things that come up in our book club tomorrow, too. And with some of the things that the author there had brought up. But I do have a question here from an attendee. And I think that this is really appropriate, especially now in the height of things like silent quitting is a term that's been going around a lot more in the last several months. But the question here is, have you ever decided when it wasn't worth the frustration to get those accommodations and just change jobs?
Yeah, definitely. I have made that decision frequently, where I will change, especially if there is an environment where I felt like I had to, you know, really fight. And I think that's because sometimes it's just easier to change jobs and to find a more accommodating environment or having a better work style for what my needs were than to make it a pitched battle. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the best course of action. It's just that is sometimes the reality. And the thing is that there are tools out there, and there's, you know, there are, particularly in circumstances of discrimination, there are tools out there like regulatory and policy tools and institutions that are devoted to combating discrimination in the workplace. but there are, contingencies to that. There are, large, or long scale timelines to consider, and also the actual justice that is necessarily enacted or resulted from isn't necessarily going to accomplish what your short-term goals are as an individual. So sometimes you'll have to make choices on, maybe there is a workplace that's going to work better for me. And it kind of can work both ways too. So if there is also, you're running up against a limitation of yourself and you feel like this isn't going to be sustainable for me, I'm pushing myself too hard, sometimes there's not going to be a reasonable accommodation that's going to be able to ameliorate what that condition is, right? Maybe you could go down to part-time, or maybe you could, change roles within that organization. But, that's where that reasonable part of reasonable accommodation, and that's why it exists. You cannot necessarily accommodate for every single challenge that you may face as a person with disability. So it's always that area, it's always that act of negotiation. What reasonable accommodation really helps accomplish is it codifies that idea that there's a negotiation between the employee and the employer about trying to meet the gap where the social model of disability really exists, right? And really, by keeping to that paradigm of realizing that it's all about a reasonable request, it's really the best way of being able to move forward. But yeah, sometimes that can occur where I just want to find a different role with a better fit in it for my disability and maybe for my career aspirations.
Kathy Hoek had put an interesting perspective here into the chat and talking about the silent quitting, and you're really like taking a look in how that phenomenon's come up, and like as we've ramped up, like thinking about what we've had to deal with in the healthcare scenario, about the necessary amount of work, what's being put on with us, in addition to some of the stress that we're experiencing in our social lives, where it's almost like we can't manage all these things that are happening, and that's kind of hitting the certain max of our imperfect body. Do we suddenly become disabled when we can't handle all of the demands that's being put on us in a workplace, even if it's just because of what's being asked of us? We are, we kind of come up like, I'm not a robot, I'm only human. I thought that was an interesting add-on, Kathy.
Yeah, for sure. I found it very interesting as well. I think the WHO recently recognized like burnout as a, illness or as a, risk factor or something like that, has had some official recognition of its place within, a wellness context. And I think one of the things that's important is that environmental context is key to really assessing ability, right? And, there is definitely a challenge to maxing out what our, possible, abilities can be in this new, it's a strange work environment that we're at, where we desperately want to increase productivity, but we are not able to do so. Like productivity has remained flat for a series of years, both from and that's really from more of like a macroeconomic lens, but that unfortunately ends up going into management styles and management decisions where they're like, how do we maximize productivity? And they just want to push workers more. So it can add work stress and the overall disposition that you are under and the context that you are under can create conditions that limit you as an individual. And that is certainly true. And the way that it can influence your personal life and lead to limitations you can look at it in a disability lens. So as I said, it's something that's very nuanced, but it is something like I said, I think that idea of disability is a universal concept, and it's something that is within all of our life paths that we think about. It's very rare for anybody to be perfectly able from cradle to grave. So, thinking about that that concept in your, day-to-day life and over your life's arc is valuable.
So we're coming up at the end of the hour. I want to thank you for your time. There was one quick here. We kind of answered it a little bit here, but I do want to tag someone else had asked if you have something quick here on how to include those who haven't disclosed their disability status. You know, where sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's difficult, but you know, what may make that fairer for the individuals and provide a level of equity. If you have anything additional there, and then after that, I think we can close up for the day.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, the thing is that and this is going to be something that is, you know, I think you're going to have a different answer depending on who the person is regarding this, right? But from my circumstance and from my life experience, I feel that you need to be able to have the tools for people to feel like they can speak up. But if they don't speak up, then you can't necessarily help them, right? Like people need to ask for help in order for help to be able to be given to them. So, you know, some of the answer that I had earlier where I was talking about making that, you know, those resources known and know that those resources can be taken advantage of without any sort of reprimand or without any sort of fear of blowback. And then also understanding a little bit more of like maybe some of your company's benefits. So they always have these like employment, what are they? The employment adaptation programs or something like that. Employment assistance,
right?
Yeah.
Employee assistance, yes. And I have used them, they're great.
Yeah, but I never take advantage of them because I'm always concerned that somehow it gets back to me. They say that it won't come back to me, but you know, but the things that are, you know, really explaining what those resources are, how they're used, how you can take advantage of them anonymously, and how they're anonymous can really help maybe those individuals that are, you know, want to disclose their disability status and feel like they have some things to bring them. But as I said earlier, I'm adamant that people need to advocate for themselves, and advocacy starts with yourself. The one last plug that I'll give is if you are struggling with any sort of reasonable accommodation and you want to have additional resources, there's something called Ask Jan. So it's the Job Accommodations Network, and it's something that is jointly ran by, I think, the Department of Labor, but it's a rich resource on disability and accommodations that fit with those disabilities, and resources on asking for them, what your rights are. It's really great because, you know, if you are making those negotiations with your employer, you can point to this website that's very official and, you know, talks about these things in a very easy to understand context, and specifically about employment, that you can help, you know, work for solutions that work for you and for your employer.
Awesome. Thanks for that. You read my mind. That was my other question. Where can we go for more? Because I definitely have more questions. So I dropped that link in the chat, askjan.org. I want to thank everyone for your time today and joining us for this amazing discussion and really thought-provoking conversation. Just as a reminder, we do have one more event tomorrow with Stephanie Whitehead leading and Kathy Hoek leading our summary to Sitting Pretty, our book club. And also, just as a reminder too, that the silent auction is also open. Please go to our Give Smart website, or you can donate directly by texting PRISM23 to 76878. That's again 76878 PRISM23. So thank you all for attending. Really appreciate you, and Thomas as well, for being here, and to all the group of people that have made this event happen.
Thanks so much. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks, Justin.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.